Everyone told him it was nothing but sand. 10 years of rust, 10 years of silence, and not one soul believed there was a single ounce of gold left in that ground. Then Cole Whitman walked onto a stretch of dead Yukon dirt that other crews had walked away from, found a machine buried up to its axles in frozen mud, and made a decision that would either make his season or end his career. What came out of that ground next stunned everyone who saw it. If you want to know how a piece of forgotten scrap metal turned into the biggest jackpot story of the year, stay with me, because this one is worth every second. The ground itself had a reputation long before Cole ever set foot on it. Locals in the valley called it the Dead Patch, and they didn't say it as a joke. A crew had worked that same stretch of land nearly a decade earlier, hauling in heavy equipment, setting up a full camp, and promising themselves a season that would set them up for life. Instead, week after week, all they pulled out of the ground was gravel, clay, and disappointment. The gold checks got smaller every cleanup until there weren't any checks worth mentioning at all. Fuel costs kept climbing, wages kept draining the account, and the machinery kept breaking down in the cold. Eventually, the operation folded in on itself. The crew packed up whatever they could carry and left the rest behind, including one heavy digger that had simply been too much trouble to drag out. It sat there through a decade of Yukon winters, sinking slowly into the mud, becoming part of the landscape people pointed to as proof that this ground had nothing left to give. Cole heard the same warnings everyone else heard. Miners who'd been in the valley for years pulled him aside before he'd even unloaded his gear and told him flatly that he was wasting his season. They said the ground had been picked over, tested, and abandoned for good reason, and that chasing it again was a fool's errand. One old-timer put it bluntly, "You can't squeeze gold out of dirt that's already told you no." Cole listened to all of it, and none of it changed his mind. He'd spent enough seasons in this business to know that the ground people give up on isn't always the ground that's actually empty. Sometimes it's just the ground where the last crew ran out of money or patience or nerve before they ran out of gold. What kept pulling his attention back wasn't exactly the dirt on the surface. It was that machine. A digger doesn't get left behind by accident. Machines like that cost real money, and no operation walks away from one unless something forced their hand. Cole walked the site slowly on his first visit, studying the old tire ruts still faintly visible under years of growth, tracing where the previous crew had dug hard and then, just as suddenly, stopped. There was no gradual winding down in those tracks. It looked like work that had been abandoned mid-motion, the kind of stop that comes from either finding nothing worth continuing for, or finding something that spooked everyone enough to leave the equipment behind and never look back. Cole couldn't shake the feeling that it was the second explanation, not the first. He gathered his crew and laid out his thinking as plainly as he could. He told them that gold doesn't always sit where you can see it, and that the real prize is usually sitting below the layer everyone else stopped digging at. It wasn't a popular pitch. Half the crew had worked seasons that went sideways, chasing exactly this kind of gut feeling, and they weren't shy about saying so. One of his longtime operators reminded him that they'd already had 3 rough cleanups this year, and that morale, fuel budgets, and patience were all running thin. Another pointed out that ground with this kind of history usually earns its reputation honestly. Cole didn't argue the risk away. He agreed it was real. What he refused to do was let a decade-old failure be the final word on what this ground could still hold. Instead of asking the crew to trust his instinct alone, Cole brought in a survey team with ground-penetrating radar and density sensors to get real numbers instead of guesses. The scan took most of a day, and for long stretches of it, there was nothing but quiet machinery and a crew standing around trying not to get their hopes up. Then the lead surveyor called Cole over with a look on his face that told everyone something had changed. The density readings coming back from beneath the surface layer were dramatically higher than the surrounding ground. The kind of reading that usually points to a compacted, heavy deposit sitting well below where the old crew had stopped digging. It wasn't proof of gold. Density alone never is. But it was the first real evidence that this ground was hiding something the previous operation had never reached. Cole ran the numbers that night by lantern light, turning the density data into a rough projection of what a deposit like that could actually mean if it held up. If the layer was as substantial as the reading suggested, a strong season could pull several thousand ounces from that ground, translating into a payday that would rewrite the story of this claim entirely. He didn't share the projection to hype the crew up. He shared it because they deserved to understand exactly what was at stake before anyone committed more time, fuel, and risk to a stretch of dirt that had already broken one crew. The number landed heavy in a room. It was enough to justify the gamble, and enough to make everyone acutely aware of how much they stood to lose if the gamble didn't pay off. That left one obstacle standing between the crew and the ground itself. The abandoned machine sitting square in the middle of the most promising section of the survey. 10 years of exposure to Yukon winters had not been kind to it. The engine was seized solid. Wiring had corroded into brittle, useless strands, and half the hydraulic lines had cracked from a decade of freeze and thaw. The camp mechanic took one look under the housing and said what everyone was thinking, that this thing was closer to scrap than to a working machine. Cole's answer was simple. He said impossible is just what people call something before they've actually tried it. And then he put the crew to work. The repairs stretched into days that blurred together. Bolts were replaced one at a time. Fuel lines were flushed and cleaned, and the hydraulic system was rebuilt piece by piece with parts scavenged and improvised in the field. Progress came in frustrating fits and starts. The engine would catch for a few seconds, raise everyone's hopes, and then die again, sending the crew back under the machine in the cold to figure out what had gone wrong this time. Sparks flew more than once, close enough to real danger that work had to stop and start over more carefully. Nights got long. People worked in gloves under floodlights with their breath fogging in front of them, running on frustration and stubbornness more than anything else. More than one crew member asked out loud whether they'd signed up to mine gold or to resurrect scrap metal, and for a while it was a fair question. Then, on a morning that started like every other frustrating morning before it, the engine caught and held. It didn't just sputter, it roared, black smoke rolling out of the exhaust as the old machine shuddered back to life for the first time in 10 years. The camp went quiet for a second before the reaction hit. Disbelief turning into genuine relief on faces that had spent days expecting another failure. Cole didn't celebrate. He stood watching the machine run, aware that getting it working was only the first hurdle. The ground still had to deliver, and after everything the crew had already sunk into this attempt, there was no room left for another disappointment. The first dig came up empty. So did the second. Bucket after bucket brought up nothing but sand, gravel, and the kind of ordinary dirt that had already broken the last operation that worked this claim. The crew's mood dropped fast, old doubts creeping back in with every empty load. Someone muttered that they were watching the same story play out all over again, just with a different name attached to it. Cole kept his focus on the ground and said little, because there was nothing useful to say until the dirt gave them an answer one way or the other. On the fourth pass, the color of the soil changed. A darker, heavier layer showed up beneath the lighter sand the crew had been pulling for 2 days straight, and the survey lead called an immediate stop to get a closer look. When the bucket came up this time, there was a dull glint mixed into the dark material that hadn't been there in any of the earlier loads. Cole reached in and lifted a handful of it into the light, and what he was holding wasn't gravel. It was raw gold, sitting in flakes across his palm, pulled from ground that had been written off as worthless for the better part of a decade. The camp erupted. People who'd spent days quietly bracing for another letdown were suddenly shouting, laughing, grabbing each other by the shoulders because the ground everyone swore was dead had just proven every one of them wrong. The experts who examined the layer confirmed what Cole had suspected from the very first day he walked the site. This wasn't a surface deposit that the old crew had simply missed by inches. It was a genuine pay layer sitting well below, where anyone had previously dug, a layer that had gone completely undisturbed while multiple operations worked the ground above it without ever knowing what was underneath their boots. The previous crew hadn't failed because there was nothing there. They failed because they stopped one layer too early. When the first full cleanup ran through the wash plant, the crew gathered around the sluice waiting for the final count with the kind of tension that made the wait feel endless. The number that came back was well into the double digits in ounces, a haul that instantly outperformed every cleanup the camp had run all season combined. It wasn't just a good number. It was proof, hard and undeniable, that Cole's read on this ground had been right when almost everyone around him had been certain it was wrong. But a discovery this size doesn't come without new problems attached to it. The same density readings that pointed to a heavy gold layer also raised real concerns about ground stability in that section of the claim, with experts warning that pockets of unstable material and the risk of a wall collapse were both genuine possibilities the deeper the crew pushed. That meant every future dig now had to be planned more carefully, balancing the pull of a proven jackpot against the very real danger of pushing too hard in the ground that had already claimed one operation before this one ever started. Layered on top of the physical risk came the practical pressures that follow any major strike, from permitting and inspection requirements to the sharpened attention of other operations in the valley who suddenly wanted to know exactly how a claim they'd all written off had turned into the best producing ground of the season. Cole understood better than anyone that the story wasn't finished. A single strong cleanup doesn't guarantee a strong season. An unstable ground doesn't become safe just because it happens to be sitting on gold. What he did know was that the ground he'd been told to walk away from had already delivered more in one dig than most operations see in weeks, and that the machine everyone had called scrap was now sitting at the center of what could become the standout story of the year. Whether the rest of that layer would hold up, and whether the crew could keep pulling it out safely, was still an open question. But for the first time in a long time, it was a question Cole was glad to be asking, because the alternative, walking away from ground like this without ever finding out, was the one outcome he'd never been willing to accept.